Hi guys, let's start part 1 of chapter 5, that is Pastoralist in the Modern World. So here's the figure 1. Sheep grazing on the Gujjars of eastern Garhwal. Gujjars are vast natural pastures on the high mountains, above 12,000 feet. They are under snow in the winter and come to life after April. At this time, the entire mountainside is covered with a variety of grasses, roots, and herbs. By monsoon, these pastures are thick with vegetation and carpeted with wild flowers. In this chapter, you will read about nomadic pastoralists. Nomads are people who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their living. So, nomads are people who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their living. In many parts of India, we can see nomadic pastoralists on the move with their herds of goats and sheep, or camels and cattle. Have you ever wondered where they are coming from and where they are headed? Do you know how they live and earn, what their past has been? Pastoralists rarely enter the pages of history textbooks. When you read about the economy, whether in your classes of history or economics, you learn about agriculture and industry. Sometimes you read about artisans, but rarely about pastoralists, as if their lives do not matter, as if they are figures from the past who have no place in modern society. In this chapter, you will see how pastoralist has been important in societies like India and Africa. You will read about the way colonialism. So you will read about the way colonialism impacted their lives and how they have coped with the pressures of modern society. The chapter will first focus on India and then Africa. The first one, Pastoral Nomads and Their Movements. 1.1 In the Mountains. Even today, the Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir are great herders of goat and sheep. Many of them migrated to this region in the 19th century in search of pastures for their animals. So, the first one is Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir. Gradually over the decades, they established themselves in the area and moved annually between their summer and winter grazing grounds. In winter, when the high mountains were covered with snow, they lived with their herds in the low hills of the Shivalik range. The dry scrub forest here provided pasture for their herds. By the end of April, they began their northern march for their summer grazing grounds. Several households came together for this journey, forming what is known as kafila. So, it's called kafila. They crossed the Pir Panjal passes and entered the valley of Kashmir. With the onset of summer, the snow melted and the mountainsides were lush green. The variety of grasses that sprouted provided a rich, nutritious forage for the animal herds. By end September, the Bakarwals were on the move again. So they are on the move again by September. This time on their downward journey back to their winter base. When the high mountains were covered with snow, the herds were grazed in the low hills. In a different area of the mountains, the Ghadis, so we have another group, the Ghadis shepherds of Himachal Pradesh had a similar cycle of seasonal movement. They too spent their winter on the low hills of Sivalik range, grazing their flocks in scrub forest. By April they moved north and spent the summer in Lahul and Spiti. When the snow melted and the high passes were clear, many of them moved on to higher mountain. So here's the source. Source A. Writing in the 1850s, G.C. Barnes gave the following inscriptions of the Gujjars of Kangra. In the hills, the Gujjars are exclusively a pastoral tribe. They cultivate scarcely at all. The Ghadis keep flocks of sheep and goats, and the Gujjars' wealth consists of buffaloes. These people live in the skirts of the forest and maintain their existence exclusively by the sale of the milk, ghee, and other produce of their herds. The men graze the cattle and frequently lie out for weeks in the woods tending their herds. The female repair to the markets every morning with baskets on their heads, with little earthen pots filled with milk, buttermilk, and ghee, each of these pots containing the proportion required for a day's meal. During the hot weather, the Gujjars usually drive their herds to the upper range, where the buffaloes rejoice in the rich grass which the rains bring forth, and at the same time attain condition from the temperate climate and the immunity from venomous flies that torment their existence in the plains. And we have a figure here, figure 2, a Gujjar mandap on the high mountains in central Garhwal. The Gujjar cattle herders live in these mandaps made of ringal, a hill bamboo, and grass from the bugyal. A mandap was also a workplace. Here the Gujjar used to make ghee which they took down for sale. In recent years they have begun to transport the milk directly in buses and trucks. These mandaps are at about 10,000 to 11,000 feet. Buffaloes cannot climb any higher. We have another figure. Figure 3. Ghadis waiting for shearing to begin. Ul Valley near Palampur in Himachal Pradesh. By September they began their return movement. On the way they stopped once again in the villages of Lahul and Spiti, reaping their summer harvest and sowing their winter crop. Then they descended with their flock to their winter grazing ground on the Sivalik hills. Next April, once again, they began their march with their goats and sheep to the summer meadows. Further to the east, in Garhwal and Kumaon, the Gujjar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Bhabar in the winter. So what is this Bhabar? A dry forested area below the foothills of Garawal and Kumaon. In the winter, Bhabar in the winter and went up to the high meadows, the Bugyals in summer. And what's this Bugyal? Vast meadows in the high mountains. So, further to the east in Garawal and Kumaon, the Gujjar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Bhabar in the winter and went up to the high meadows, the Bugyals, in summer. Many of them were originally from Jammu and came to the UP hills in the 19th century in search of good pastures. This pattern of cyclical movement between summer and winter pastures was typical of many pastoral communities of the Himalayas, including the Bhotiyas, Sherpas, and Kinnaris. So these are different groups. All of them had to adjust to seasonal changes and make effective use of available pastures in different places. When the pasture was exhausted or unusable in one place, they moved their herds and flocked to new areas. This continuous movement also allowed the pastures to recover. It prevented their overuse. So their movement is also helpful to the nature as well. Now figure 4, Ghadi sheep being sheared. By September, the Ghadi shepherds come down from the high meadows, dhars. On the way down, they halt for a while to have their sheep sheared. The sheep are bathed and cleaned before the wool is cut. 1.2 On the plateaus, plains, and deserts. Not all pastoralists operated in the mountains. They were also to be found in the plateaus, plains, and deserts of India. Dhangars were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra. So we have another group, that is, Dhangars were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra. In the early 20th century, their population in this region was estimated to be 467,000. Most of them were shepherds, some were blanket weavers, and still others were buffalo herders. The Dhangar shepherds stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra during the monsoon. This was a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil. It was covered with thorny scrub. Nothing but dry crops like bajra could be sown here. In the monsoon, this tract became a vast grazing ground for the Dhangar flocks. By October, the Dhangars harvested their bajra and started on their move west. After a march of about a month, they reached the Konkan. This was a flourishing agricultural tract with high rainfall and rich soil. Here the shepherds were welcomed by Konkani peasants. After the Kharif harvest was cut at this time, the fields had to be fertilized and made ready for the Rabi harvest. Dhangar flocks manured the fields and fed on the stubble. The Konkani peasants also gave supplies of rice which the shepherd took back to the plateau where grain was scarce. With the onset of the monsoon, the Dhangars left the Konkan and the coastal areas with their flocks and returned to their settlements on the dry plateau. The sheep could not tolerate the wet monsoon conditions. So their movement again starts. So we have a figure here, figure 5. Raika camels grazing on the Thar desert in western Rajasthan. Only camels can survive on the dry and thorny bushes that can be found here. But to get enough feed, they have to graze over a very extensive area. We have some new words. Kharif, the autumn crop, usually harvested between September and October. Rabi, the spring crop, usually harvested after March. Stubble, lower ends of grain stalks left in the ground after harvesting. In Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, again the dry central plateau was covered with stone and grass, inhabited by cattle, goat, and sheep herders. The Golas herded cattle. So we have another group, the Golas. The Kurumas and Kurubas reared sheep and goats and sold woven blankets. They lived near the woods, cultivated small patches of land, engaged in a variety of petty trades, and took care of their herds. Unlike the mountain pastoralists, it was not the cold and the snow that defined the seasonal rhythm of their movement. Rather, it was the alternation of the monsoon and dry season. In the dry season, they moved to the coastal tracts and left when the rain came. Only buffaloes like the swampy, wet conditions of the coastal areas during the monsoon months. Other herds had to be shifted to the dry plateau at this time. Banjaras. So we have another group which is called Banjaras. So Banjaras were yet another well-known group of graziers. So Banjaras were yet another well-known group of graziers. They were to be found in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. In search of good pasture land for their cattle, they moved over long distances, selling plough cattle and other goods to villages in exchange for grain and fodder. Here's source B. The accounts of many travelers tell us about the life of pastoral groups. In the early 19th century, Buchanan visited the Golas during his travel through Mysore. He wrote, "Their families live in small villages near the skirt of the woods, where they cultivate a little ground." So what they do is that they cultivate a little ground and keep some of their cattle, selling in the towns the produce of the dairy. Their families are very numerous, 7 to 8 young men in each being common. So 7 to 8 young men, so it's a common thing, and their families are very numerous. 2 or 3 of these attend the flocks in the woods, while the remainder cultivate their fields and supply the towns with firewood and with straw for thatch. In the deserts of Rajasthan live the Raikas. Then we have another group. In Rajasthan, called raikas. The rainfall in the region was meager and uncertain. On cultivated land, harvest fluctuated every year. Over vast stretches, no crop could be grown. So the raikas combined cultivation with pastoralism. During the monsoons, the raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner stayed in their home villages. So during the monsoons, the raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner stayed in their home villages where pasture was available. By October, when these grazing grounds were dry and exhausted, they moved out in search of other pasture and water and returned again during the next monsoon. One group of raikas, known as the Maru raikas, desert raikas, herded camels, and another group reared sheep and goat. So one group they herd camels and the other group they reared sheep and goat. So we have a new figure, figure 6, a camel herder in his settlement. This is on the Thar desert near Jaisalmer in Rajasthan. The camel herders of the region are Maru Raikas and their settlement is called a Dhandi. Then here's another figure. Figure 7. A camel fair at Balotra in western Rajasthan. Camel herders come to the fair to sell and buy camels. The Maru Raikas also display their expertise in training their camels. Horses from Gujarat are also brought for sale at this fair. So we see that the life of these pastoral groups was sustained by a careful consideration of a host of factors. They had to judge how long the herds could stay in one area and know where they could find water and pasture. They needed to calculate the timing of their movements and ensure that they could move through different territories. They had to set up a relationship with farmers on the way so that the herds could graze in harvested fields and manure the soil. They combined a range of different activities like cultivation, trade, and herding to make their living. How did the life of pastoralists change under colonial rule? So let's find out. Here's a figure, figure 8, a camel fair at Pushkar. Here's another figure. Figure 9. A Maru Raika genealogist with a group of Raikas. The genealogist recounts the history of the community. Such oral traditions give pastoral groups their own sense of identity. These oral traditions can tell us about how a group looks at its own past. So they have their own oral traditions. So here's another figure. Figure 10. Maldhari herders moving in search of pastures. Their villages are in the run of Kutch. Number 2. Colonial rule and pastoral life. So we have a source C. H.S. Gibson, the Deputy Conservator of Forest, Darjeeling, wrote in 1913, "Forest which is used for grazing cannot be used for any other purpose and is unable to yield timber and fuel, which are the main legitimate forest produce." Under colonial rule, the life of pastoralists changed dramatically. Their grazing grounds shrank. So the changes are their grazing grounds shrank, their movements were regulated, the revenue they had to pay increased, their agricultural stock declined, and their trades and crafts were adversely affected. So, how did the colonial rule affect them? Let's find out. First, the colonial state wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. Land revenue was one of the main sources of its finance. By expanding cultivation, it could increase its revenue collection. It could at the same time produce more jute, cotton, wheat, and other agricultural produce that were required in England. To colonial officials, all uncultivated land appeared to be unproductive. It produced neither revenue nor agricultural produce. It was seen as wasteland that needed to be brought under cultivation. From the mid-19th century, wasteland rules were enacted in various parts of the country. So what happened from mid-19th century? From mid-19th century, wasteland rules were enacted in various parts of the country. By these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over and given to select individuals. These individuals were granted various concessions and encouraged to settle these lands. Some of them were made headmen of villages in the newly cleared areas. In most areas, the lands taken over were actually grazing tracts used regularly by pastoralists. So expansion of cultivation inevitably meant the decline of pastures and a problem for pastoralists. So like this, their lives were affected. And we have the second one. By the mid-19th century, various forest acts were also being enacted in the different provinces. And the next problem which they faced was the forest acts, which were enacted in the different provinces. Through these acts, some forests which produced commercially valuable timber like deodar or sal were declared reserved. No pastoralist was allowed access to these forests. Other forests were classified. So some forest like which where the valuable timber like deodar or sal are grown, they are declared as reserved. And some other forests were declared as protected. So in these, some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were granted, but their movement were severely restricted. So in the reserved forest, no pastoralist was allowed access to these forests. And as for the protected forest, some customary grazing rights. So some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were granted, but their movement were severely restricted. The colonial officials believed that grazing destroyed the saplings and young shoots of trees that germinated on the forest floor. The herds trampled over the saplings and munched away the shoots. This prevented new trees from growing. So this is the reason why they don't want any herders or any pastoralist in this area. These forest acts changed the lives of pastoralists. They were now prevented from entering many forests that had earlier provided valuable forage for their cattle. Even in the areas they were allowed entry, their movements were regulated. They needed a permit for entry. So, what is this customary rights? Rights that people are used to by custom and tradition. The timing of their entry and departure was specified, and the number of days they could spend in the forest was limited. So everything was regulated. A pastoralist could no longer remain in an area even if forage was available. The grass was succulent and the undergrowth in the forest was ample. They had to move because the forest department permits that had been issued to them now ruled their lives. The permit specified the periods in which they could be legally within a forest. If they overstayed, they were liable to fines. And the third problem which the pastoralists faced was that British officials were suspicious of nomadic people. They distrusted mobile craftsmen and traders who hawked their goods in villages and pastoralists who changed their places of residence every season, moving in search of good pastures for their herds. The colonial government wanted to rule over a settled population. They wanted the rural people to live in villages, in fixed places, with fixed rights on particular fields. Such a population was easy to identify and control. Those who were settled were seen as peaceable and law abiding. Those who were nomadic were considered to be criminal. In 1871, the colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes. They were stated to be criminal by nature and birth. Once this act came into force, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements. They were not allowed to move out without a permit. The village police kept a continuous watch on them. Here's a source. Source D. In the 1920s, a Royal Commission on Agriculture reported the extent of the area available for grazing has gone down tremendously, with the extension of area under cultivation because of increasing population, extension of irrigation facilities, acquiring the pastures for government purposes, for example, defense, industries, and agricultural experimental farms. Now, breeders find it difficult to raise large herds. Thus, their earnings have gone down. The quality of their livestock has deteriorated. Dietary standards have fallen and indebtedness has increased. And the fourth problem which the pastoralists faced is that to expand its revenue income, the colonial government looked for every possible source of taxation. So they searched for every possible source of taxation. So tax was imposed on land and on canal water. Okay, so tax was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods, and even on animals. Pastoralists had to pay tax on every animal they grazed on the pastures. In most pastoral tracts of India, grazing tax was introduced in the mid-19th century. The tax per head was the tax per head of cattle went up rapidly and the system of collection was made increasingly efficient. In the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect the tax was auctioned out to contractors. These contractors tried to extract as high a tax as they could to recover the money they had paid to the state and earn as much profit as they could within the year. By the 1880s, the government began collecting taxes directly from the pastoralists. Each of them was given a pass to enter a grazing tract. A cattle herder had to show the pass and pay the tax, the number of cattle heads he had, and the amount of tax he paid was entered on the pass. So that's all guys. See you in my next video. Bye.